Jesus wept. In English, in the King James Version, this is the shortest verse in the whole Bible. And it's a rare one, too. The only other time we see Jesus weeping, besides this scripture, is sitting on the hills overlooking Jerusalem right before he dies. He weeps. And he cries out how much he longs to just take everybody under his wings, protect them, shield them from the horrors to come, including the horrors they inflict upon themselves. But Jesus' wings aren't wide enough. He can't protect them, and he knows he can't. And so Jesus weeps. Jesus weeps in this scripture too when his friend Lazarus dies. First, one of Lazarus' sisters and then the second come to Jesus and they tell him, if you had been here, maybe our brother would not have died. And after Jesus hears this, after he sees Lazarus' family weeping and all the people around the family weeping, after they invite him to come and see Lazarus for one last time, Scripture says Jesus wept. The short verse, in English, it's just 2 words, and they take just a second to say, Jesus wept. But telling what happened is a lot easier than living through it. And telling what happened is a lot quicker than living through it, too. And I suspect that even though you can say those 2 words really quickly, Jesus wept, that Jesus wept for a lot longer than just 1 single second. Sorrow and weeping are not the only feelings that Jesus has when his friend dies. Scripture tells us he was greatly disturbed in spirit, which is, it turns out, a really polite translation. In the Greek, it says something more like Jesus was enraged. Jesus was enraged when his friend died, filled with fierce anger at something that should not be, at death, that powerful force that comes and takes everything, no matter how hard we try. Jesus was enraged. There's one other place in the scriptures where Jesus is enraged like this, filled with fierce anger. You probably remember, right before he dies, when he finds money changers cheating and defrauding the poor in the temple. He drives them away. Some versions of the story, he's so angry that he overturns the tables and he even uses a whip. Jesus was enraged in the temple, and he was enraged when Lazarus died. Weeping and grief are deeply personal, and they are profoundly communal. Rage and fierce anger are deeply personal, and they are profoundly communal too. These emotions that erupt out of Jesus, that come bursting forth from us when something happens that should not have happened, they are personal. Why do horrible things happen to people that we love? And they are communal, part of something that is much larger. Why do horrible things keep happening in the world at all? I like this story about Lazarus and Martha and Mary because it reminds me that families are complicated, that they have so much in common, but not even brothers and sisters who have the same parents and the same experiences are guaranteed to react in the exact same way. Both of Lazarus' sisters, both Mary and Martha, start with that rage. Jesus, if you had been here, then maybe he wouldn't have died. Mary gets a little more honest more quickly. She kneels before Jesus. She weeps with him, offers to accompany him. She says, I know where they've laid him. Come and see. For Mary, that rage leads quickly to tears, which lead to accompanying someone. Martha, on the other hand, starts with rage too, but then she seems to take a deep breath and say what she has learned from her tradition, from her Lord. I know, she says, that God will do whatever you ask, Jesus. And then, because this is the Gospel of John telling the story, in the Gospel of John, everything is a theological discourse. They have this little theological conversation, Martha and Jesus, about resurrection and when it happens and how it happens. Is it at the end of time? Is it now? What will it look like? And the story culminates with Jesus saying those famous words, I am the resurrection. He says, I am the life. Do you believe this? And Martha says, yes, Jesus, of course I do, because you are the Messiah, the living God. And then the theological discourse ends. There is, as Mark points out, a whole other section to this story that we didn't hear read this morning. Jesus does, in fact, go to the tomb, orders Lazarus to come out, and Lazarus does, with his shroud and grave clothes still clinging to him. He stumbles out of the tomb. He is restored to life with his family. And this story in the Gospel of John is kind of a little foreshadowing of what will come if Jesus has even power over death. The authorities start to think that there is nothing that Jesus cannot disrupt. And the story takes a turn. Resurrection happens, but it doesn't always last. Lazarus is resurrected from the dead, but Lazarus doesn't actually get to live forever, at least not the way he used to live. We know that even though Lazarus has experienced resurrection, that one day he will die again. Resurrections are sometimes like this. They come along after lots of conflicted relationships and tears and people showing up too late. Resurrections sometimes are incomplete. When we come back to life, just like Lazarus, things that bind us still cling to us. And they take a long, long time to get untangled. So why bother? Why bother talking about resurrection at all? What good is new life that doesn't last? What good is resurrection if death sometimes seems to win anyway? There's another way, I think, of looking at this story. What if Jesus' response to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life, is not just a creedal statement, which it is? What if it is a fundamental declaration about how resurrection also sometimes works through people? People who feel rage and grief, who blame each other, who can't agree about how families work. What if rage and grief and conflict are not impediments to resurrection? What if rage and grief and conflict are the way that we get to resurrection? Rage at what has been taken from us can be a gift. It keeps our love for what is absent alive. It even brings that love back to life sometimes. And so much is taken over the course of our lives. Our health, people we love, places we love, our sense that nothing will ever change, people who we thought would always be there next to us, all those things are taken away. But after a while, that rage, that lava, that red hot emotion stops flowing out of us and it cools. And like lava, it hardens into new structures, new places that are solid enough for us to stand on. And we are born anew. tears at what has been taken from us can be a gift too. Tears keep our love for what is absent alive. Sometimes even the tears even bring it back to life. When we look at the world through tears, everything is blurry. We cannot see where we begin, where we end. Everything is all mushed together through the filter of deep, deep sadness that someone or something we love is not here anymore. But eventually the tears stop flowing. They wash us and clear our sight, and then one day we look at the world in a new way. And we see that our love is not gone, that God has suffused that love through every part of our lives, every corner of the world. Tears clear us out until we can see that love does not just live in a single person, a single place. It is everywhere, all the time, being resurrected in every corner of the world in gentleness and kindness and new life. The ancient Greek writer Aeschylus wrote about the connection between suffering and resurrection like this. He wasn't a Christian, but still somehow he was writing about these things. He writes, "Even in our sleep, the pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop on the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." Imagining this kind of resurrection hurts. It cannot be jumped too quickly. Maybe that's why when Martha is talking to Jesus, she says, "I know that everyone will rise again at the end of time." But with this kind of resurrection, the kind that comes through conflict and rage and tears, the trappings of our suffering can cling to us for a long time, just as those grave clothes clung to Lazarus. When the unthinkable happens, the only God who makes sense, the only God whose awful grace we could possibly endure, is a God who rages with us. The only God who makes sense, is the God who also weeps at the grave of his friend. The only God who makes sense, the only God worth clinging to, is a God whose heart breaks with ours, who has promised to never let us go, who clings to us more closely than those grave clothes, who has promised that in life and in death and in life beyond death, God will wrap us in God's arms. This is the God who I see in Jesus. This is a God whose hope I can proclaim even when all evidence suggests that I should do otherwise. This is a God who knows what it is to suffer, a God who knows that coming back to life is never easy, but it is good, and it is trustworthy, and it is true. Victor Hugo, the French novelist and poet, lost a child. And after that loss, he wrote a poem called "Written at the Foot of the Crucifix." And loosely translated from French, the poem sounds like this: "You who weep, come to this God, because this is the God who weeps. You who suffer, come, because this is the God who cures. You who tremble, come, because this is the God who smiles. You who pass, come, because this is the God who endures." Jesus wept. So do we. Jesus was enraged. So are we. Jesus' resurrection and life. And so sometimes, even in our despair and almost against our will, we too can come back to life.